All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, early October 1794, there is a push to quell a series of uprisings that had been brewing. I apologize.
Boo.
They're brewing. I know, sorry. These uprisings had been brewing in western Pennsylvania by farmers and distillers. This was in response to the country's first nationwide internal revenue tax, which had been implemented a few years earlier. It was an excise tax on distilled spirits. So the door for liquor puns is now open because we are talking about distilled spirits. Look, farmers and distillers were fighting back against this tax. Tax collectors were being harassed. Local authorities, little overwhelmed in this moment. President Washington is like, we need to send in the federal troops. It becomes a whole thing. And actually, it would go well beyond just the taxing of whiskey. This really planted the seeds in many ways for a movement and an ideology that would eventually come to dominate the ascendant Republican Party. Not to mention, this was a really big test for a new government's ability to implement taxes and, govern. So we've got Washington and Hamilton's involved, and there's booze and there's farmers. Why wasn't this in the musical? Was this in the musical? I don't know.
It got a line where Jefferson says, we get frisky if you try to tax our whiskey.
Oh, there you go. See, I've not seen the musical, as people know, but anyway, it was in the musical. But we are going to do more than just one line on the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. Here to do that, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
I'm glad I got a line in the musical. So yes, Hamilton's involved. Obviously, it's big question of a new government ability to govern and ability to tax. But can we lay out the reasons for the implementation of this tax? No surprise, it has a little bit to do with we need to make up some money because we took on some debt. So what is
I mean, basically, the federal government has to pay for its independence. It has to pay for the war. And so it says in order to pay for this war, we're going to initiate taxes. And the best way to do that is to tax something that everybody loves, which is alcohol. And so while this might seem sort of like a feasible tax for the East Coast cities or the East Coast states, places like Massachusetts and Rhode Island where there are lots of distilleries, it really is a hard sell for the states, that are further out west that have a huge demand on themselves in trying to pay this tax and get their product to places that it needs to go to. They have to go all the way over the Appalachian Mountains, I believe. Yeah. And so, it's difficult. It's difficult to sell this product, but to put a tax on top of that is even more taxing, so we say, for the people who are engaged in it.
And one small point there, when we say, the rural places out west and the frontier, we're talking about Western Pennsylvania and
right,
Virginia, like that. That's the kind of, but those are the parts.
No.
That, yes.
Well, and to put a finer point on it, for distilleries who were selling whiskey to be consumed, at pubs and people to drink it at home, it was no problem to just pass that cost on to the people who were buying it. But the reason why folks in like Western Pennsylvania were making whiskey is because getting grain to market, it was difficult to do for all the reasons that Kellie said. And so in order to make it more portable and to make it last longer, they would turn that grain into spirits. And so it wasn't that these folks were selling the whiskey. They were often bartering it. They didn't have cash to pay taxes to the federal government. It's not that they were trying to go get people drunk. They were trying to sell their crops. And this was the only way they could do it.
Yeah. I want to take half a step back here and point out what strike me as just like a couple interesting parallels here, which is, we speaking of the musical Hamilton, right? We did it. There's that famous scene about the room where it happened and that meeting where there's a deal brokered between Hamilton and Madison and Jefferson. And we did an episode about that. And that is largely about who's going to take on debts, as we cobble together this new country, are we going to assume places debts? And that really is the origin of this story as well, right? It's the 13 colonies, their Revolutionary War debts come onto the books of the new country, and the new country now needs to raise some money. And this is the first tax that they implemented to do that.
And
so,
it's fragile too, because the country is new. And remember, the country goes to war over taxes, essentially.
Well, not just taxes. But, part of me is like, don't you remember when a bunch of people got upset about a tax over a cherished a drink? Not that long ago? Like, wasn't that where this whole thing started? Haven't we learned that people don't like to have their brown liquids taxed?
Wait. I'm pretty clear it was just not having the representation that made them like the taxes. Otherwise, they would have been happy to pay, so no problem.
Right. So, I mean, I'm surprised, there wasn't there must have been like Boston Tea Party alums floating around saying, wait a minute. But it is an interesting parallel. But, it's kind of like it's the classic like dog that catches the fire truck. It's like, you want to be a country? Well, here's what it takes. You got to tax people and piss them off, right? Especially on stuff that they really love. So, we discussed kind of like the particular tricky territory here in terms of who was going to get taxed and at what level, and also how those were going to get collected. And I mean, it is just this interesting picture of like you send tax collectors out into these rural places sort of on their own. They like knock on a door. There is no federal infrastructure, and that's really where the seeds of this rebellion, so to speak, come up. It's just really people basically like harassing the local tax collector and being like, no,
Yeah, people. I mean, it's tough because people are just trying to do their jobs and people are just trying to live their lives. And it's 18 cents per gallon is the tax rate. So it's not nothing. It's a significant amount, especially if you are living paycheck to paycheck, so to speak. And so these tax collectors really have a tough job because they have to enforce these taxes, but they don't have a militia behind them. They're not armed per se, and they just have to tell people, hey, listen, this is the law. You have to follow the law. And in a place when you're out west, which is sort of lawless, right? And you have those same people who often feel marginalized and unprotected because they're often fighting Native Americans for their territory, and they feel that the government has abandoned them in some way, and then the government shows up not to protect you but to collect taxes. You could see why people would be upset by this.
And not just upset. I mean, people see these tax collectors as the symbol of all of those grievances that Kellie was laying out. And so they don't just refuse to pay taxes, they attack the tax collectors. They might shoot at them, a mob might gather, and this gets joked about a lot, they get tarred and feathered, which is a pretty horrific thing to do to a human being, right? Like to coat them in hot tar, which is impossible to get off, which burns you as it sticks to your skin, and then dumping feathers over the top of that and then kind of parading them through town. So it's a pretty brutal response, and you can understand why some tax collectors maybe weren't super enthusiastic about going after these folks for their taxes.
Kellie, this is a little bit of an aside, but Kellie, you study violence in this era a little later on, but in the late 1700s into the 1800s, we hear this phrase, tarred and feathered. We hear like running someone out on a rail, which actually is a sort of actual activity. I mean, how much is this kind of stuff actually happening? These aren't just euphemisms,
I mean,
right?
it's happening. It's violent. I mean, now we think of it as spectacle. And it was spectacle. I mean, the idea of being feathered is the humiliation. People died from this. I mean, your skin is literally being burned off. Not everyone survives this, and if you do, you kind of wish you hadn't. I mean, it's brutal. And there are not a lot of policing forces. I mean, if you think about it, the idea of like cops or people that are controlling these mobs is sort of non-existent. And so you really have people being moved by the mob or being moved by popular opinion. And if you're on the wrong side of that opinion, it can be super violent.
Yeah. And actually, it's so funny. I was, I had sort of mentioned offhand running out on a rail as another thing, running someone out on a rail, which is a saying now, but, was actually a practice of like putting someone on top of a fence rail and then carrying them out and like sort of taking them out of town. And it was often associated with tarred and feathered. If you look up running out on a rail, a lot of the examples of that are from Western Pennsylvania during the Whiskey Rebellion, where people were being tarred and feathered and run out on a rail. I know there was a scene in the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, where someone gets run out on a rail, and that's the first time I realized, like, oh, this isn't just a saying, this is a thing that would happen. But yeah, so you get some of this specific pushback, attacks on tax collectors. Before we get to how that spirals out of control and the response from the federal government, Kellie, you kind of hinted at, like, it's one thing to have the government come and ask for money, and that, that's a financial burden, but you also are weighing that against what is this government doing for me, right? And I think this story is so tied up in, as we're talking about, this is the American frontier at the moment. This gets tied up in lots of other questions around, well, is the federal government protecting us from so-called Indian, from Indian attacks? Is the government protecting us from these other things? And it really just gets at this fundamental question of who is this nascent government for, and what is their role, and what do we get in return for our participation in this?
And the federal government, in many ways, was trying to keep these Western settlers from pushing into indigenous territory, and people on the frontier were furious about this. And so they saw themselves not just as unprotected, but as like the federal government siding with Native Americans, which they absolutely hated. And so somebody like George Washington, who's now president, is becoming unpopular in some of these areas. And Washington sees this happening, and he, in 1792, puts out a proclamation saying, you can't interfere with the laws of the country. You got to straighten up and fly right. And that is not what happens.
No. And I think, Washington's also up against a rock and a hard place too, because he doesn't want to have to send in the troops. He doesn't want to have to enforce this, because he knows that the look of sending in troops and forcing people to pay these taxes is also, public relations wise, not gonna help him in the long run. And so, the optics of this, I think, are really important, how this enforcement gets handled. At the same time, Washington knows that he can't just let them get a pass. Certainly not when other states are also paying their taxes.
We've been doing this show for a number of years now, and it feels like we've done so many episodes where the precipitating moment that we've picked is the moment where federal troops get sent in, right? And you have a local uprising, and you have skirmishes, and then the federal troops getting sent in, the local government saying, we can't handle this, we're going to call for help, is the moment where it blows over. And, as you were saying, it's exactly rock and a hard place, chicken and egg kind of thing. Like, you send in those troops because it looks like it's getting out of hand, but often the sending in of the troops is the thing that just takes things to the next level. And, we see it in every century all the way up to, like, Ferguson, in Baltimore. Yeah. Like, I mean, it just is this really interesting dynamic that continually plays out. So what are the details of what happens when the federal government has to finally respond here? We talked about that proclamation, but then we have, like 12,000, 15,000 militiamen starting to come into Maryland, Jersey, Pennsylvania, Virginia.
So it takes a little while for this all to happen, but in the summer of 1994, a U.S. Marshal...
1794. although there are 1994 parallels too. I was going to ask you about that, but you said 1994. Yeah.
So in 1794, a U.S. Marshal goes to serve writs telling people who had not paid their taxes that they have to go to court. And that they are responded to with violence. A mob gathers, and you start to get this conflict between people who were helping the marshal and people who were opposing the marshal. And ultimately, the local militia is sent in, and then the federal soldiers are sent in, and you have these military conflicts that are breaking out. And it's in response to that George Washington is like, this is getting out of hand. Like, we're not just about to lose this tax money. This could devolve into something that's ultimately injurious to this very fragile new nation.
I mean, the military effectively shuts a lot of these rebellions down. But for the people who are arrested, for the people who are attempting to flee or run away, they have to be held accountable, essentially. Some of them, interestingly, I mean, George Washington pardons, and I think it's because he was trying to strike a balance between enforcing the taxes, but not coming down so hard that it would incite another backlash for coming down too hard. So the militia definitely shuts it down, but at the end of the day, there are a few people that got convicted of treason, but 2 men that also get pardoned by Washington as well.
And before all that happens, Washington leads troops into battle.
Yeah.
It is the first and only time that a sitting president has led the military. We decided shortly after that that's not a great idea. But he leads troops into battle as part of his role as a general and as part of his role as commander-in-chief, and helps to put down some of these riots when faced with thousands of federal troops. You do manage to disperse some of these mobs and some of these uprisings. And then, as Kellie is saying, then it's a matter of trying to strike a balance between holding people accountable and being the kind of lenient, generous leader. And that over the next few years is kind of the balance that Washington is trying to strike.
The fallout.
Well, the fallout is, right, in many ways, it becomes less on the ground and less about this violence, and it really becomes political, right? Because what happens here is we have this emerging anti-tax, anti-federal government ethos that's coming out of these rebellions, and the violence subsues, but really this, in many ways, prompts many of the people in these regions to, on the one hand, accept the Constitution, but then realize that they needed to enact political power. And that is really where you get the rise of republicanism. And a lot of these parts of the country start to vote for Republicans, which become a challenge to the Federalists. Federalists have to rethink their role about government. But, it is this interesting dynamic that we see time and time again, where you get these sort of rebellions, stuff happening on the ground, and then it's like, okay, the rebellion gets squashed. Keep your eye on those next 10 years, because then it doesn't morph into a political process.
Well, I always think, too, that the consequence in a lot of these rebellions, specifically the rebellions that are led by white Americans, is that Native Americans and Black people are like the first to lose out. They're always sort of like the first casualty. So concessions are made, whether it be further onto Native American territory or the further expansion of slave labor, but the concessions are almost always made at the expendability or at the expense of Indigenous and Black people. And that is how you get a lot of these rebellions to stop, too.
Yeah.
At the same time, there is a hopeful note to this story, which is that the transformation of violence into politics is a good path, right? The idea that, like, the changes that we want to see in society, we can enact through voting. And you're absolutely right, Kellie. Like, sometimes that's just cleaning up anti-democratic, anti-illiberal ideas and giving them the sanction of democracy, or giving them the sanction of majoritarianism. I do think in this case, like, that's sort of like then the basis of the two-party system that would ultimately emerge, and the partisan system that would emerge. And those roots, both the disciplining of violence into politics, but also at whose expense it came, is the story of the United States.
Yeah.
Isn't it, though? It so is. It totally is.
And, specifically, I mean, there's so many things, we could talk about that happening now. We see the sort of right-wing violence of the last 5 years or so, and then all of a sudden, wait, so-and-so's running for office now, or so-and-so's, we see that, and that's probably what happened here. It's like this guy who was tarring and feathering a tax collector 5 years later is running for a local office. And sure.
And once again, at the expense of Black and Indigenous people.
And I take your point, NIki. Like, sure, I guess that's better than continuing to tar and feather people, but it's also like, that's where questions of accountability come in and all these things.
Exactly. And it's something that you see that happens with the violence at the end of Reconstruction that then sort of grows up into Jim Crow, or as you were saying, Jody, like the violence of the insurrection at the Capitol that is now graduating into insurrectionists running for Secretary of State so they can do it without the mob and pitchforks next time.
Yeah.
Specifically, though, anti-tax ethos. NIki, we talked about your book and you had your nice little slip of the tongue about 1994 earlier. But, we did our episode, the very first episode of Partisans we did was about the black helicopters and the idea that like tax collectors are going to come crashing down your door. And then even in that story, we had a representative who kind of was laundering these ideas into the halls of Congress. And so can you talk a little bit about just that specific fear of the tax collector and how that often seems to be something that pops up?
Because the tax collector is, for many Americans, one of those places where the federal government is most visible in their lives, especially most visible in a way that they kind of chafe against. And for instance, you see this big anti-tax movement in the U.S. in the 1970s that's born out of opposition to property taxes in California during a time of high inflation, but then sweeps across the nation. And while a lot of that is like ballot initiatives and the people you're voting for in office, there was also a deeply embedded violent anti-IRS movement in groups like Posse Comitatus, in Christian nationalist groups, where people ended up going to jail because they were plotting against people in the IRS. Because again, the IRS was seen as illegitimate because taxes were seen as illegitimate, and therefore violence was in many ways a legitimate response. So you see that blending of violence and politics when it comes to the IRS, not just in the tax collectors in the 18th century, but in the 20th and 21st as well.
Sure. And, I'll say of the many things that have sort of chilled me over the last 6 months or so, this rumor that came up, which is total bullshit, but about that Biden is hiring all these armed tax collectors. That just, to me, just... I've seen that take hold. I've heard people I know repeat that, and it just ties into all the things you're saying. I'm like, that is an entry point to violence, and I think
that's proto Ruby Ridge stuff. Yep.
Yeah. Well, anyway,
on that note.
So there we go. On that note. Right. Okay. So I have another note, which is actually almost as depressing, but maybe a little less depressing. But in 2011 in Western Pennsylvania, there's now a Whiskey Rebellion festival, and it has live music and food. It made me think of how Claire Malone was telling us how there's now like a Cleveland river burning festival. It's like embrace the weird thing. Except for at this festival, there is apparently a historic reenactment of the tarring and feathering of a tax collector. And I'm just like,
that's not great.
That's not. I don't want to be drinking a hazy IPA and watching a reenactment of a tarring and feather. Not for.
I mean,
I want a stout when I watch it.
It's just, this is like the gladiators. I think of like Rome, and like it's a bit macabre.
Yes, I would say so. All right. Well, anyway, that brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.